My dad would tell us the story growing up, like, 'cause he loved plants and he had a green thumb. He could make anything grow. He would always say, people are like plants, and a plant is only as good as its roots. The plant's going to be okay if the roots are strong.
Did you ever feel some sort of imposter syndrome or feel like you were out of place at all?
Constantly. Now, here's the thing. I knew I looked different and I brought different things to the table. And I was confident about those things. It's funny when I think about it, and again, it goes back to the whole roots conversation. Like I was very
Mhm.
proud of being the different. The other was seen actually in a very positive, very receptive manner. People were very curious about the Middle East. People were very curious about my faith, and in part because it was right at the time when, the Clintons just had a very global perspective, and they knew it was an asset. I remember, shortly after I was hired, we were doing all these trips to the Middle East. So like, send her. She's a good representative. I mean, I would go and do these advanced trips. And what is advanced? The basic core, an advanced person is an ambassador. You are an ambassador for, the principal or the administration of the group that you're representing. Having said all that, there were plenty of times where I'd walk into a room and say, I'm not prepared, or I don't know enough to run this meeting or be part of this meeting, or I don't even know what I'm doing. And I was too scared to admit it. So I would, my first trip to Buenos Aires, or like, oh, you go do an advanced trip for the First Lady of the United States. She's going to go give a speech in Argentina. I'm like, I don't know anything. And I just figured I would fake it. And, until I met another woman who Leah Pizar, who remains today to be a good friend of mine, to kind of be my mentor through the process. But I had so much imposter syndrome in my early 20s.
I think it's fairly common too. I'm curious to hear what are some things that obviously your background, your ability to speak multiple languages, your
Yeah.
deep understanding of the Middle East, and I do think that even culturally, like going to Turkey for me, it's such a special experience because it's that it takes a village concept
Hmm.
where everyone shows up for their neighbor, families are raised together,
Yeah.
and it's really special and different from how we raise families in America. There's just I think a deep misunderstanding of Islam, and for me, I was in high school on the heels of 9/11, and that's a whole other conversation, but,
Yeah.
I do think that perspective is invaluable in understanding to the depths that you did, but I'm curious to hear, you know, what you were doing to continue learning and improving beyond having mentors. Was it work ethic? Was it trying to get exposure to, you know, new things, new assignments?
The funny thing about not having a plan is that professional plan is that I wasn't scared to ask to do things that maybe the average person in my position would think, okay, I'm not qualified for that. So, for example, the first big promotion. So when I started, my first job actually was technically office manager and assistant to the deputy chief of staff for policy. And what that meant is I had to draft her policy correspondence. So I would have to like go to the library upstairs and do research on things like what's the impact of female genital mutilation on women, which was a common practice at the time in parts of Africa and even in the Middle East. And the reason it was relevant to the work we were doing in government is that it was not illegal in this country, in the United States, in 1996. It was not illegal here, and so Hillary, as First Lady, and a group of House and Senate members were trying to pass legislation to make it illegal here, and so I started there, and then there was an opening for trip director or deputy trip director in the White House, and that was this extraordinary opportunity to travel and to plan trips and create and organize and um, really kind of tell. And as I always say, it's telling the story of the administration. And there were so many more women had more experience, had traveled more, had done advance, and I went and knocked on the door and said, I want to be considered for this position. I talked to the woman who was running the program, the department. I said, I want to be considered. I knew I was the youngest. I had traveled the least. I probably was not as confident as these other women. But just had this gut inside of me of like, I'm gonna try out for it, and I got the job. And it's shot and any objective person would say on paper, she was the least qualified. But it was seeing what I had to offer that was different, but also the confidence it takes to basically say, "Let me compete."
That's the self-assurance piece we were speaking to
Yeah,
earlier. I think, there
yeah,
is data supporting this, that women will look at a job responsibility for a new position and just, count themselves out
yeah,
oftentimes, and
yeah.
that men are like, "Cool, I've done 10%
Yes,
of this,
yes.
I'm all
Yeah.
in."
Yeah.
It's great that
We
you have
talk
that.
about this all the time.
Yes.
And I think the point that you made about sort of growing up in Turkey and having that there's a certain confidence that I think comes out of having this sense of security, the sense of there's always going to be somebody there and I'm sure you were raised a certain way, like these certain cultural expectations of when there's a wedding, you go and you celebrate with the family. When there's a funeral, you go and you stand in solidarity as they mourn. Like there's this sense of what we call the ummah, the community.
Mhm.
And I think that gives you sort of a solid core of confidence that it's not something you're conscious of. You just are that way. You walk in the world that way. And I think it maybe explains a lot about how you've ended up where you ended up and how I ended up where I ended up.
Yes, that I think is the biggest privilege of all. It's
Yeah.
that foundation and that rooting, I think. It's, like, really grounding, it really connects you, you feel very protected and secure and like you can do anything because what's the worst that could happen, you know?
Completely.
Yeah.
My dad used to tell the root story, which I now have heard is apparently like a Moroccan proverb, but my dad would tell us the story growing up, like, 'cause he loved plants and he had a green thumb. He could make anything grow. And he would always say people are like plants, and a plant is only as good as its roots. As long as you take care of the roots, nourish that soil, it doesn't matter, winter, storms, the plant's gonna be okay if the roots are strong. And that at the end of the day, that's something that I think you and I can both really it resonates with both of
I
us.
got the same. Mine was, articulated less beautifully, but for from my dad. I talk about how my mom she taught me that I needed to be independently, just independent and have an education.
Yeah.
My dad's was you have to be secure with who you are and really focus on yourself and make sure that you're good because then you'll have the most to give to the
Yes.
world.